Good morning, everyone. So glad you could join us today for Paul's Adventures and Impartation.
Well, good morning. Let's continue from where we left off yesterday in 1 Corinthians 13, and this is verse 13. Yet now are remaining faith, expectation, and love, these three. Now, your Bibles probably say faith, hope, and love, but the word in Greek is actually expectation, which has a far better definition. These three are remaining, yet the greatest of these is love. Faith in Hebrew is actually trust, then expectation, and then agape love, which you'll remember will stop at nothing short of accomplishing the Father's purpose. These three qualities, faith, expectation, and agape love, these do not get discarded, but remain today and looking forward even beyond our limited vision in this eon. Now, how do we know that? Well, Paul places this statement in verse 13 after everything else that precedes it, including the yet then statements that refer to our celestial position. When he says, yet then when the maturity comes, and yet then this and that. And as you remember, we talked about that referring to when this eon is done and these mortal bodies change into immortal bodies. This statement about what remains, faith, expectation, and love, comes after all the yet then these will be discarded statements. The first three words in chapter 14 are huge. Be pursuing love. But be careful here. Pursuing the kind of love that Paul is talking about won't look like you might think. He's talking about the Father's kind of love, that which seeks only your highest and best, and it comes with a price. Agape may repel everyone else around you who does not support or serve the Father's best interests in your life. They might think they're supporting or serving your best interests, but they're not thinking with the same mind, obviously, as the Father is. Pursuing this love is entirely worth it, but it may not feel that way during the pursuit. You'll know the Father and the Son in ways you never imagined, for sure, but except for them, you may also be completely alone. Not lonely, mind you, but alone. Just imagine when you wake up in the morning and you're looking at the Father on the throne, you're at His feet, and you're just looking at Him saying, what today? Father, what would you have me do today? What's next on your list? And Him telling you. That's just worth it all. So let's look also now at verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 14, and we'll spend a little time on this today. Paul says, for he who is speaking in a language, that is, in tongues, speaking in tongues, is not speaking to men, but to God. For no one is hearing, yet in spirit he is speaking secrets. This is one of the most delightful aspects of exercising your spirit. You are speaking directly to the Father. No intermediaries. A straight, high-speed connection to the one who said, let there be you. What's better than that? Well, when you hear the Father speak to you, that's even better. Now, you may never know, of course, what your spirit is praying. That's what he just said. For no one is hearing, yet in spirit he is speaking secrets. But you don't have to think of what words to pray, which I think is just a great relief. Coming up with the right prayer at the right time with the right words, forgive me, but that's just a pain. Here, praying in the Spirit, not only do you not have to think of what words to pray, you don't have to think at all. You don't come up with words in the Spirit anyway. You begin making sounds, and pretty soon you've got phrases and paragraphs. You only engage your brain to decide to speak out of your spirit, and it does the rest. It's the most complete form of prayer and communication with the Father you can experience as a human being. Listen to that. It's the most complete form of prayer and communication with the Father that you can experience as a human being. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Let me take you to Matthew 6:6. This is something Yeshua said that's not unlike Paul's statement earlier when he said, "For no one is hearing." Here's what Yeshua said in Matthew, again, chapter 6, verse 6. "Now, whenever you may be praying, enter into your storeroom and locking your door, pray to your Father who is in hiding, and your Father who is observing in hiding will be paying you," as in paying attention to you. Don't do this out in public. Go in this secret place. Get in behind closed doors. Pray to your Father who is in hiding himself, and your Father who is observing you in hiding will be paying attention to you. And then in verse 7, Yeshua said, "Now in praying," listen to this, "you should not use useless repetitions, even as those of the nations, for they are supposing that they will be hearkened to," listen to this word, "in their loquacity," meaning all the sounds that they're making, in their constant sound making, they are supposing that they will be hearkened to. He says, don't use useless repetitions, even as those as the nations. He's talking about Gentiles, of course. And in verse 8 he says, "Do not then be like them, for aware is God your Father," check this out, "for aware is God your Father of what you have need before you request him." God already knows what you need. Forgive me for saying it this way, but prayer is really not to get something from him. He already knows whatever it is you need. Prayer is for you. Prayer is what you can do. The Father already knows what you're going to pray for. He already knows what you're going to be asking him. And when you're praying in the Spirit, you don't even have to figure any of that out. It's automatic. Now, this useless repetitions, that's a great phrase. Useless repetitions that Yeshua addresses in verse 7 may be religious chanting rituals that were practiced among the Gentiles. Now, I don't know that that's what he was talking about, but useless repetitions, that sounds pretty close.
That might too be nagging God for something. It's like God knows. Heaven's view is always perfect, and that's the point of firing your brain and quit doing your Christmas wish list to God. Firing your brain and just praying in tongues so you can go to heaven, find out what's going on, and come back down with the right answer from the right access instead of just regurgitating your Christmas list. Doesn't make any sense. What if God's trying to save you from something you want because he knows where that path would lead? Well, why don't you just peace, be still, and know God? That's the point. When you're praying in the Spirit, I just love, because I just get to go to heaven and come down with a different thought. And the answers, because you're in a whole different realm. Father, I pray that the hidden things come to light and what's not of you is exposed and removed. Now, I'm not going to touch that with my brain that got me. My brain got me into the messes I've been into. How's it going to get me out? It isn't. But when you're in the presence of God, because you've shut out all that other mess, and you just pray in a language you don't know, and ascend to the presence of the living God. And then he'll give you answers. He'll just show you. And it's a wonderful place to live, because you just don't have to be bothered with trying to figure things out. Praying in the Spirit clears your brain of this realm.
Yeah, it's very freeing. And Paul says something just like what you were talking about in verse 14. He says, "For if I should be praying," we're back in 1 Corinthians now, "for if I should be praying in a language," that's in tongues, "my spirit is praying, yet my mind is unfruitful." Now when he says, my mind is unfruitful, he acknowledges that his mind, our minds, are quiet when we are praying in languages, in tongues. This is a distinguishing fact between the language of your spirit coming out of your mouth versus reciting or chanting a mantra, like in Transcendental Meditation, for instance. And we're going to put up a video on the webpage that comes from a news report done several years ago of a study that examined the brain activity of people praying in tongues versus people meditating. It's not the highest quality video, but it's good enough, and you'll learn a startling and important difference between these two phenomena, between praying in your spirit and meditating or chanting. I'm not going to spoil it for you by telling you what the difference is. You'll see it for yourself, but it's dramatic. Now, I'm going to read a section now from chapter 14, beginning in verse 34. Let the women in the ecclesias hush. For it is not permitted to them to speak, but let them be subject, according as the law also is saying. That is such a stretch for him to invoke the law here. Verse 35, now if they want to learn anything, let them be inquiring of their own husbands at home. For it is a shame for a woman to be speaking in the ecclesia. This gets so abused. These two verses get so twisted, and they can cause such an enormous amount of trouble in churches. And it's not hard to see why. If you don't know the cultural context, you'd think that Paul is being downright hostile to women. This, by the way, is one of the problems with taking absolutely all the scriptures literally and you just do what they say. That's a mistake here, huge. If you don't know the cultural context, the time that this was written, what was going on in the ecclesias, especially in Corinth, then this would look like hostility on Paul's part. He's not being hostile. The Corinthian ecclesia, and probably others because he uses the plural, ecclesias, were made up, you'll recall, mostly of former pagans, and they had real trouble with unruly women in the assembly. They probably had trouble with unruly men, but he talks to them separately. And I get the fact that Paul, growing up a Hebrew, women, from all I can deduce, were really treated like second-class citizens. Sorry about that. That was then. This is now. Different ballgame. But he had real trouble with the unruly women in the ecclesia. Never mind having to deal with former temple prostitutes among these newly converted pagans. They didn't know about decorum. That's all this was about. They didn't know really how to be judicious about themselves. So if someone holds up those two verses as some kind of legal requirement, if you're ever in an assembly of people or a church or something, they're misapplying it because they completely misunderstand it. We went to visit this church. We were invited, and when we walked in, we saw all these women putting on crocheted doilies, is what we called them, these head coverings. And they all did this. And we didn't understand what that's about. And then I think it was the pastor's wife explained to us
Ask, why do the women all have doilies on their heads? She said so they can speak. If they have something to say, they can speak. It's like, oh, please. And when we left, she said, well, I hope y'all come back. I said, things would have to change a lot for us to do that.
It was...
Oh, please.
That was one of the only places I've ever been where you could see a church that was dying.
Yeah.
Just no life in it at all. And every one of the women had to have this little, it didn't cover their heads, but kind of like a Jewish yarmulke. But that is part of the law. They're supposed to have their heads covered. And women put a head covering on too. Because of a legal requirement that's Old Testament. Paul says, yet let all occur respectably and in order. Now, if people read that properly, they'd understand why he had to write the other two verses we read before, because obviously they weren't letting everything occur respectably and in order, so he had to set them straight. That's his job as an apostle. Let everything occur respectably and in order is an entirely reasonable statement. But for the state of many in the Corinthian ecclesia, Paul would never have had to be so strident about this stuff. But that's the burden of an apostle, as I said. Always holding up the plumb line, as if to say, and this is what Isaiah did say in chapter 30, verse 21, this is the way, walk in it, in case you turn right or in case you turn left. This is the way. That was Paul's job. That's part of why we read Paul, why we pay attention to him. It's not like he's talking to us because we're out of order. He's addressing order. And in this case, he's addressing people who were out of order. And an apostle brings order, sets order, and insists on maintaining order. Now, what comes next is Corinthians chapter 15. This is the big picture chapter. There's so much in it that I'm not going to start it today. We'll leave things where we are today, and tomorrow we'll get into the big picture that Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So until then, may Yehovah bless you and keep you. May Yehovah light up his face toward you and be gracious to you. May Yehovah lift his face to you and appoint peace for you. Amen.